The rain had been drumming against my windows for 3 hours straight when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, cutting through the sound of the storm like a blade. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 12:17 a.m. Living alone in suburban Portland had its perks, but midnight visitors weren't one of them. I'd moved into this modest 2-story house 6 months ago, drawn by the quiet neighborhood and the reasonable rent. My neighbors kept to themselves, which suited me fine after the chaos of my divorce. I grabbed my robe and padded downstairs, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floors. Through the peephole, I could make out a figure hunched against the rain, Mrs. Patterson, from next door. She was clutching a flashlight, her gray hair plastered to her head, looking nothing like the composed woman who always waved from her garden. Mrs. Patterson. I opened the door, immediately feeling the cold October air rush in. "Are you okay?" She looked up at me with wide, urgent eyes. At 72, she'd lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone, and I'd never seen her look so rattled. "Alex, I'm sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "But you need to check your guest room. Right now." My heart skipped. What? Why? I've been watching from my bedroom window. Couldn't sleep with this storm. There's been movement in your upstairs guest room for the past hour. Light flickering on and off. She gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Someone's in there." I felt my mouth go dry. The guest room had been empty since I moved in. I'd barely set foot in it myself, using it mainly for storage boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. "Are you sure it wasn't just lightning reflecting off something?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head firmly. "I've lived through plenty of storms, dear. This was different, deliberate, like someone was using a flashlight or their phone." The logical part of my brain searched for explanations. Maybe I'd left a window open and something was blowing around. Maybe it was an electrical issue with the old wiring. But standing there in my doorway at midnight, with rain soaking the threshold and my elderly neighbor looking genuinely frightened, logic felt thin. "Should we call the police?" I asked. I already considered it, but what if we're wrong? What if it's just she trailed off, but we both knew what she wasn't saying? What if it was my ex-husband? The divorce had been messy. Thomas had a key to this place. We'd bought it together before everything fell apart. The restraining order was supposed to keep him away, but legal documents didn't always stop desperate people. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Don't go alone." Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to the door. "I'm coming with you." "Mrs. Patterson, you should go home, get dry." "Nonsense. I've got 3 grown sons, and I raised them through their teenage years. I can handle whatever's up there." Despite my fear, I almost smiled. There was steel in this woman that her gentle, gardening demeanor usually hid. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept by the front door, precaution I'd taken after the divorce. Together, we climbed my staircase, each creak of the old wood sounding unnaturally loud. The house felt different at night, shadows deeper, familiar corners suddenly menacing. At the top of the stairs, we paused. The guest room door was closed, just as I'd left it. No light showed underneath. Everything looked normal, but Mrs. Patterson was right. Something felt wrong. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling slightly. Behind me, Mrs. Patterson had her flashlight ready, though she held it like a weapon rather than a tool. The handle turned easily. I pushed the door open and fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with harsh overhead light, and we both gasped. The space was exactly as I'd left it, cardboard boxes stacked against one wall, a few pieces of furniture covered with sheets. But the window was wide open, rain pooling on the hardwood floor beneath it. The curtains were whipping in the wind, and scattered across my unopened boxes were muddy footprints. "Oh my God," I whispered. Mrs. Patterson moved past me, her fear apparently replaced by indignation. Someone was definitely here. "Look at this mess." I approached the window carefully, my heart pounding. It faced the backyard, overlooking the wooded area that separated our neighborhood from the main road. From up here, someone could easily see into Mrs. Patterson's bedroom window across the yard. "The lock's been forced," I said, examining the window frame. Fresh scratches marked the wood around the latch. Mrs. Patterson was studying the footprints. Size 10 or 11, I'd guess. And they're fresh, still wet. I pulled out my phone, hand shaking as I dialed 911. This wasn't my imagination or a misunderstanding. Someone had broken into my house, been in this room for who knows how long, and might still be nearby. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. On the floor, next to one of the boxes, partially hidden under a sheet, was a small digital camera. It wasn't mine. 911, what's your emergency? "Someone broke into my house," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. They might still be in the area. As I gave the dispatcher my address and details, Mrs. Patterson picked up the camera with a tissue, careful not to touch it directly. "Alex," she said quietly, "this has been recording." The red light was still blinking. 2 police officers arrived within 10 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the rain as they searched my backyard. Officer Rodriguez, a woman about my age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took our statements while her partner, Officer Williams, processed the scene. "The good news is whoever did this is long gone," Rodriguez said, closing her notepad. "Footprints lead from your window to the tree line, then disappear into the woods. Bad news is they had plenty of time to get away. I was sitting on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, still trying to process what had happened. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on staying until the police finished, and honestly, I was grateful for her presence. What about the camera?" I asked. Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Williams. "We'll need to take it as evidence, but I can tell you what we found. It's been recording for approximately 6 hours, starting around 6 p.m. My stomach dropped. 6 hours. Someone had been watching my house, planning this, for 6 hours. The footage shows someone climbing through your window around 11 p.m., Williams added. Male, average build, wearing dark clothing, and a baseball cap. Face isn't clearly visible, but we've got enough to work with." Was he just watching me? The thought made my skin crawl. "Looks like he spent most of the time going through your boxes," Rodriguez said gently, like he was looking for something specific. "Did you recently move? Store anything valuable up there?" I shook my head. "Just old papers, photo albums, books. Nothing worth stealing." Then a thought hit me. Unless what? "My divorce papers are in one of those boxes. Bank statements, property documents. My ex-husband, we had a very contentious split. He might be looking for financial information. Or..." I trailed off, not wanting to voice my growing suspicion. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "I told you I'd been watching for an hour before I came over. But thinking back, I might have seen someone moving around earlier too. I just assumed it was Alex." "We'll need information about your ex-husband," Rodriguez said. "Name, address, any recent contact." As I gave them Thomas's details, I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. We'd been married for 8 years, together for 12. I thought I knew him, but the man who'd screamed at me during our last court hearing felt like a stranger. "There's something else," Williams said, consulting his notes. "The camera wasn't just recording randomly. It was positioned to capture both your house and Mrs. Patterson's bedroom window." Mrs. Patterson and I exchanged alarmed looks. "You think he was watching both of us?" she asked. "It's possible. Or he wanted to make sure he knew if anyone was awake and might see him." After the police left, Mrs. Patterson insisted I come stay at her house for the night. "No sense sleeping alone after something like this," she said firmly. "I've got a spare room, and frankly, I'd feel better knowing you're safe." Her house was the mirror image of mine, but filled with 40 years of living family photos covering every surface, comfortable furniture worn smooth by use, the lingering scent of the chocolate chip cookies she'd baked earlier that day. "I keep thinking about those boxes," I said as she made us tea in her cozy kitchen. What could Thomas possibly want from old papers and photo albums? Mrs. Patterson set a steaming mug in front of me. Sometimes it's not about what they want to find. Sometimes it's about what they don't want you to have. What do you mean? In my experience, men like your ex-husband, controlling types, they don't like losing control. Maybe he wasn't looking for something. Maybe he was trying to take something away from you. I thought about the boxes upstairs, filled with memories of our life together, documents from happier times. Was Thomas trying to reclaim pieces of our shared history or destroy them? Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something? Earlier, when you said you'd been watching for an hour, why were you looking out your window in the first place? She was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. I haven't been sleeping well since my husband died last year. Sometimes I just sit by the window, especially during storms. It's peaceful usually. She met my eyes, but tonight felt different. Call it intuition, but I had this feeling something was wrong even before I saw the light in your guest room. "Thank you," I said, "for watching out for me, for coming over despite the storm. We look out for each other in this neighborhood. Always have." She patted my hand. "Besides, I like you. You remind me of myself at your age, trying to rebuild after life knocked you down." That night, lying in Mrs. Patterson's spare room, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was just the beginning. If Thomas was desperate enough to break into my house, what would he do next? And what exactly was he looking for in those boxes that he couldn't just ask for? I picked up my phone and scrolled through our old text messages, looking for clues I might have missed. Most were mundane, scheduling, logistics, the cold exchanges of two people dismantling a life together. But one message from 3 weeks ago stood out. "You can't just erase what happened, Alex. Some things should stay buried." At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about our marriage, the mistakes we'd both made. But now, lying in the dark listening to rain against unfamiliar windows, I wondered if Thomas had been talking about something much more specific. Something he thought might be hidden in those boxes. Something worth breaking into my house to find. The next morning brought clearing skies and fresh perspective, but also more questions. Officer Rodriguez called around 9 a.m. while Mrs. Patterson was making breakfast. "We ran the footage through our system," she said. "Got a partial facial recognition match. It's not your ex-husband." I felt relief and confusion in equal measure. Then who? "Name's Brian Walsh. He's got a record, mostly petty theft, some B&E charges. But here's the interesting part. He was hired. We found payment records on his phone." "Hired by who?" "Still working on that. The payment came through a third-party app, fake account. But whoever hired him knew your house, knew about the guest room window, knew your schedule." After hanging up, I sat at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, trying to process this new information. If Thomas hadn't broken in himself, he'd hired someone to do it. That felt somehow worse, more calculated, more invasive. What did the police say? Mrs. Patterson asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. I explained about Brian Walsh and the hired break-in. She listened thoughtfully, occasionally nodding. "So your ex-husband was smart enough not to violate his restraining order directly, but still wanted access to your house," she said. "The question is why those boxes were so important. I need to go through them properly," I decided. "There has to be something I'm missing." "Not alone, you don't," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "If someone's willing to hire a burglar to get at those boxes, we need to be careful." An hour later, we were back in my guest room. The police had cleared the scene, but I'd asked them to leave the boxes untouched so I could inventory them myself. With Mrs. Patterson keeping watch, I began going through everything systematically. Most of it was exactly what I'd told the police: old tax returns, photo albums, college memorabilia. But as I dug deeper into the third box, I found something that made my hands freeze. It was a manila envelope I'd forgotten about, buried beneath a stack of our old vacation photos. The envelope was labeled in Thomas's handwriting, "Portland Project Confidential." "What's that?" Mrs. Patterson asked, noticing my expression. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside were architectural drawings, permit applications, and what looked like environmental impact reports, all dated from 5 years ago, all related to a commercial development project in southeast Portland. "I remember this," I said slowly. "Thomas was working on some big development deal when we lived in California. He was so secretive about it, said it was too early to discuss details." I spread the documents across the floor. The project was massive, a mixed-use development that would have displaced a historic neighborhood and several small businesses. According to the papers, Thomas's construction company had been the primary contractor. "Look at this," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to one of the environmental reports. It says there were significant concerns about soil contamination, but the report was amended 3 times. I found more documents, correspondence between Thomas and city officials, records of payments that seemed unusually large for permit fees, and most damning of all, a letter from an environmental consultant expressing concerns about the safety of the proposed construction. But what made my blood run cold was the final document in the envelope, a newspaper clipping from the Portland Tribune, dated 4 years ago. The headline read, "City Council member dies in car accident. Development deal under investigation." The council member was Michael Torres, and according to the article, he'd been investigating irregularities in the Southeast Portland Development Project when he died. The investigation died with him. "Oh my God," I whispered. Mrs. Patterson was reading over my shoulder. "Your ex-husband was involved in something serious, wasn't he?" I nodded, my mind racing. The project never got built. I remember Thomas being devastated, said the investors pulled out after some political complications. But if this Mr. Torres was investigating corruption, and then conveniently died before he could expose it, Mrs. Patterson finished grimly. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for Michael Torres. The accident report was brief. Single car collision on a rainy night. Vehicle went off the road into the Willamette River. No other cars involved, no witnesses. "This is why Thomas hired someone to break in," I said. "He knew I had these documents. Maybe he forgot about them during the divorce, or maybe he thought I'd thrown them away." "But you didn't throw them away. I never even looked through this envelope. I was so angry during the divorce, I just packed everything of his I could find and shoved it in boxes." Mrs. Patterson sat back on her heels. "So your ex-husband might be involved in corruption, possibly worse, and these documents could prove it." "It looks that way. But Mrs. Patterson, if Thomas was willing to hire someone to break into my house for these documents, what do you think he'll do when he realizes I still have them?" As if in answer to my question, my phone buzzed with a text message. From Thomas. "We need to talk. I know you found the Portland papers. This doesn't have to get complicated." I showed the message to Mrs. Patterson, and her face went pale. "He's been watching," she said quietly. "How else would he know you found them?" I looked around the guest room, suddenly feeling exposed. The forced window had been repaired that morning. But what if there were other ways Thomas was monitoring me? "We need to call the police," I said. But even as I said it, I realized the problem. Officer Rodriguez had said they were still trying to trace who hired Brian Walsh. Until they had proof, it was just my word against Thomas's. And Thomas was very good at making people believe his version of events. My phone buzzed again. "Meet me at Riverside Park, 2 p.m. Come alone. Bring the envelope." Then another message immediately after. "Don't involve the police. You don't understand how deep this goes." Mrs. Patterson grabbed my arm. "You're not seriously considering meeting him?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But Mrs. Patterson, what if he's right? What if this really does go deeper than just him? That city council member died 4 years ago, and nothing ever came of the investigation. All the more reason to involve the authorities. But what if the authorities can't be trusted? What if that's why Michael Torres died? We stared at each other, both realizing that we'd stumbled into something much more dangerous than a bitter ex-husband trying to retrieve old documents. "There's one thing I know for certain," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "Whatever you decide to do, you're not doing it alone." I decided to meet Thomas, but not on his terms. Instead of going alone, I asked Officer Rodriguez to meet me an hour before the appointed time. Mrs. Patterson insisted on coming too, positioning herself at a nearby coffee shop where she could watch the park entrance. "I still think this is too dangerous," Rodriguez said as we waited on a bench overlooking the Willamette River. "But if he's willing to talk, maybe we can get him to admit to hiring Walsh." The manila envelope sat between us, its contents photographed and copied as evidence. I'd spent the morning researching the Portland Development Project, and what I'd found made me sick to my stomach. The southeast Portland neighborhood that would have been demolished was home to a community center that served hundreds of low-income families. The historic buildings Thomas's company planned to tear down had been home to local businesses for decades. And the environmental concerns weren't just about soil contamination. There were reports of potential groundwater issues that could have affected the entire area. "How well did you know your ex-husband?" Rodriguez asked. "I thought I knew him completely," I said. "But looking at these documents, I'm not sure I knew him at all." Thomas appeared right on time, walking across the park with the confident stride I remembered from our early years together. He looked older, more tired, but still carried himself like a man used to getting his way. "Alex," he said, nodding to Officer Rodriguez. "I see you didn't come alone." "You hired someone to break into my house, Thomas. What did you expect?" He sat down across from us, his expression unreadable. "I never wanted it to come to this. When the divorce was finalized, I thought that envelope was gone for good." "Why?" Rodriguez asked. "What's so important about some old construction documents?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the river. When he finally spoke, his voice was differente smaller, less certain than I'd ever heard it. "Michael Torres wasn't killed because of the Portland project," he said. "He was killed because of what he found out about me." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" "The soil contamination reports were falsified. I knew about the groundwater issues and buried them. If that development had been built, it would have poisoned the water supply for thousands of people." Thomas looked directly at me. Michael Torres figured it out. He was going to expose everything. Rodriguez leaned forward. "Are you confessing to murder, Mr. Chen?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "I didn't kill him. But I know who did and I know why." "Then tell us." The Portland project wasn't just about real estate. It was about moving money, a lot of money, for people who don't like questions being asked. When Torres started investigating, he wasn't just threatening my construction company. He was threatening a network of investors who had a lot more to lose than I did. I stared at my ex-husband, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, and realized I was looking at a stranger. "So you just let him die?" I asked. "I tried to warn him," Thomas said, and for the first time, I heard genuine emotion in his voice. "I called him the night before the accident, told him to back off, that he was in danger. But he wouldn't listen. He said he had enough evidence to bring down half the city council." "And you have proof of this?" Rodriguez asked. Thomas nodded toward the envelope. "Those aren't just my company's documents. Torres gave me copies of everything he'd found: bank records, communications between investors and city officials, evidence of bid rigging on dozens of projects. He wanted me to corroborate his findings." "But you didn't." "I was a coward," Thomas admitted. "After he died, I was terrified. I buried the documents, moved to California, started over. I thought if I kept quiet, they'd leave me alone." "But they didn't," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "A few months ago, someone contacted me. said they knew about the Portland documents, knew I had copies of Torres's evidence. They wanted them destroyed permanently. Thomas looked at me with something that might have been regret. I thought you'd thrown them away during the divorce. When I realized you might still have them, you hired Brian Walsh to break into my house. I was trying to protect you, Thomas said, but even he didn't sound convinced. These people don't just threaten, they follow through. If they thought you had access to Torres's evidence. Rodriguez stood up abruptly. We need to get Alex somewhere safe now. What? Why? I asked. Because if your ex-husband is telling the truth, and these people killed a city council member to keep their secrets, they won't hesitate to kill you too. She was already on her radio, calling for backup. Thomas grabbed my arm. Alex, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to get involved in this. You made me involved the moment you hid those documents in our house, I said, pulling away from him. And you made it worse when you hired someone to break in instead of just asking me for them. I couldn't risk you reading them. I couldn't risk you knowing. Knowing what? That I was married to a man who chose profit over people's lives? Who stood by while someone was murdered? I was young. I was scared. You were 35, Thomas. You weren't some kid who didn't know better. Rodriguez finished her radio call and turned back to us. We're going to take you both into protective custody while we investigate this further. And Mr. Chin, you're going to tell us everything you know about these investors and their network. As we walked back toward the parking area, I saw Mrs. Patterson emerge from the coffee shop, her face tight with concern. She'd been watching the entire conversation, and I knew she'd seen enough to understand that this was far from over. What happens now? I asked Rodriguez. Now we find out how deep this corruption goes, she said, and we make sure the people responsible for Michael Torres's death finally face justice. But as we reached the patrol cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something important. Thomas had confessed to covering up environmental hazards and withholding evidence, but something about his story didn't quite fit. If these mysterious investors were so powerful, so dangerous, why hadn't they simply eliminated Thomas years ago? Why wait until now to demand the documents? And why had they allowed him to live after hiring Brian Walsh failed to retrieve them? Looking back at the park at the river where Michael Torres had died 4 years ago, I realized that our midnight visitor had set in motion something much larger than a simple break-in. The truth was finally going to come out, but the real question was whether any of us would survive long enough to see justice done.